Hi, I'm Eric. I'd like to welcome you out to my part 2 of instructional video for Hot Licks. This particular edition, I'd like to talk about basically an overview. It's going to be like a walkthrough of some of the major aspects of the techniques I like to use. They will be kind of broad frameworks and examples of the important tools to me that I employ in my own personal playing, and hopefully it'll be something that ultimately you can use in your own personal playing. So I'd like to start off first with 6 important techniques to me that I'll keep kind of in 6 different categories. Now, the first one is going to be tuning, which we need to tune up anyhow first. So I'm going to give you a G to start tuning from. Here's a B. That's an E first. A D. A, E, 6th. Okay. Now there's a reason that I started with the G 3rd rather than giving you one of the E's. It's very important to me to start in the middle, notationally the middle of the scale of the guitar, and work your way out as you tune. This is a technique that I kind of thought was a good idea to take from piano tuners, because they usually tune the middle section of the piano and then they'll tune the treble and the bass after that. And the point being is that the 12-tone Western scale is far from being a very exact in tune type of scale. It's actually, you're dividing the octave up in a very non-tunable way. So what they do is they call temperament, where you actually tune it all out to where it's a little out of tune all the ways, but it's not very noticeable because it's tempered out. That tuning is tempered out over the course of the piano or the instrument, so it's kind of negligible to the ear. And this makes it much better for playing with any kind of instruments or any kind of recording or live situation. You'll find that you'll be able to tune much in more of a unison with any instruments. So I always start with a G, and then I tune out towards the top with the 3-point tuning system that I think I might have discussed in the first video, which is to either fret at the 4th fret or to chime an octave at the 12th and match it on the, I think it's the, what's that, 8? Yeah, 8th fret of the B. And you could do the same on the B. You can also use the high chimes. Anyhow, the point of the 3 tuning process is to just kind of double check the strobe of your guitar and kind of, once again, kind of even out the neck inconsistencies with the inconsistencies of the 12-tone Western scale. And so, now once this is done, actually the precursor to doing this is to always kind of stretch the strings out and tune up. You don't want to tune down. If you have to tune down, once you do flatten the strings, you want to always stretch them back out and tune up. This way you'll hold your tune a lot better. Otherwise, when you stretch the strings, if you're a player that stretches strings, you're just going to go flat all the time, and you'll have all sorts of tuning problems. So that's important to try to remember too. So anyhow, so we just try to tune out, you know, from the G out to the E and the E here. Sometimes I'll actually leave the D, A, and E string just a little bit flat, ever so slightly, like hardly any at all on the D, just a small bit on the A and a little bit more on the E, and then the top strings might be just ever so slightly sharp, and that way you can get the whole thing to tune in better. And if you're overdone with a keyboard, a properly tuned keyboard in the studio, it'll fit into the track a lot better. Let's go on now to the second important technique I'd like to discuss, which is picking. And as I've discussed before in the first video, the type of picking I like to do is where you pick up away from the pick guard. Now, with this technique, which has been discussed before, I've been trying to add, usually my style was to pick up, as you can see here, the side of the pick right here, picking up, and then I would follow that with any downstrokes, were just typical downstrokes, like straight across sideways. So the kind of a new version I'm trying to do is to where I can do a mirror image downstroke of the upstroke. So the upstroke picks up and the downstroke picks up with the opposite side of the pick. So you technique I'm trying to work on right now so that I can free myself up to use either an up or down stroke depending on the passage or the type of tone you want to get, because they'll sound a little different. So and on with this, there's also the kind of what I call the piano technique, where I use pick and fingers, which I do a lot of, where I'll use the pick, but then my second and third fingers predominantly will play along with it, and you kind of, to get kind of almost like a steel guitar sound or a piano, you get all the notes at once. And I'm particularly fond of that technique because it kind of sounds like a steel guitar or a piano, which I particularly like. And of course, then the third type of picking I like to talk about is basically just with the fingers. Now, what can be used with this? By the way, that's usually just the thumb and the second and third fingers. Sometimes for punctuation, I'll use the first finger on the way down. And one technique I'm still working on, which I can't talk much about now because I can't do it yet, is more of the classical approach. The bass guitar or a classical guitar, which is a totally different tone, and I'm still kind of working on that. Hopefully get that together someday. But for now, it's more of the folk kind of technique. And one variation of the all-finger technique is where you choke the notes, like basically what I'm doing when I do that is after I hit the note, either usually with my second finger, I'll come back and stop it with the second finger, or the thumb, actually the first thumb. With the thumb, I'll stop the note again on a downstroke. It's kind of useful for a kind of a country thing, or if you're doing legato, you can mix it up and have some. The mixing up kind of will add certain accentuations to the ones where you choke them. Other ones you let be more legato. That'll add color to the playing. And it's basically a kind of a country western style, but it can be used in any kind of piece. And the all-finger technique, rarely used on electric. It's more of a kind of an acoustic guitar thing, which I hope to be able to show you some vignettes of that as this video goes along. This next technique I'd like to talk about is fingering. First off, I'd like to get into the subject of what I call positive fingering, which is a term I just like to, where you actually, by a very kind of, can be a long process of trial and error, you learn to find what would sort of be the sweet spot of where your finger hits the fretted note. much like a violin player tries to find when they're playing their instrument. There's a certain sweet spot they have to learn for the particular type of fingers they have, the particular type of instrument they use. And through a process of trying a lot of different ways, you can find where the connection has a better tone and allows for more concise, clear playing, especially when you're playing fast. So in other words, if I was to kind of just barely hit the string in an inefficient manner, like, now if I was to adjust that to where I found my particular sweet spot, you can kind of hear it and you can feel it in your fingers. So it's a process of where you're just really kind of making the right kind of connection with it. And it's something that just with, like I say, with trial and error, you'll find what's right for you. Now sometimes the disadvantage of not hitting the fret correctly, you can in a way use that to your advantage if you want more of a kind of a muted sound. You don't want the efficient attack of the string. You want more of a kind of a laid back kind of. Take some of the sprightness away from the note, which if that's what's desired to get, then you can kind of do it the opposite way, which is just kind of using the side of the finger in more of an inefficient way. But typically, I don't really, unless I'm going for that particular effect, I like to try to get that sweet spot. And when you're using a distorted tone especially, you'll notice a difference in the type of tone you get. It's one of the at least it's one of my personal secrets that I try to remember when I'm working on my lead sound, because it really can have a lot to do with the way your fingers hit. You know, you can do a lot with the equipment, but really it boils down to the way your fingers make that connection with the note. And then of course the other exceptions are if you're playing chords and you want to use the bottom of your fingers. It's of course necessary not to find that sweet spot. But you'll actually find that there's sort of a sweet spot underneath the fingers is the way you hit with those two. Pretty much every way you fret the guitar, there's a certain place as per the frets and tonality and your own particular fingering style. And so just a couple other exceptions to this single note sweet spot they're trying to find, other than the chords, of course, where you're playing with the fingers just flat out against the neck. But also, of course, there would be double note lead stuff that you would have to stray from that idea where you're... So the last one will be one that I kind of touched on before, which is actually fingering two notes at once with one finger. If you had a certain chord, like say this chord, it would be almost impossible, I think, to play that chord unless you were to use one finger for two notes. And here I'm using the second finger over the E and A. I just fret right in between it, which I kind of discussed in the last video. But those are just a few exceptions to what otherwise you want to try to find that sweet spot to where you can really get the kind of sound that, you know, right on the right place in the string. And once again, you can kind of feel when it's right and you can hear when it's right. Okay, so the fourth technique that I'd like to talk about is dampening. This will be both with the left and the right hand. And not only the left and right hand, but I'd like to point out that within either hand there's going to be bass dampening as well as treble dampening for either. And they both go on consecutively. So first let's start with the right hand dampening. Now most of the bass section dampening is going to be used with the side of the palm through here, sometimes through this side, but mostly the back section right here. I'd like to just demonstrate, if you can, maybe try to see what I'm doing as I play through some passages. with the right hand, you'll be wanting to do treble dampening, which the point of that is to catch the high strings so they're not just making a lot of noise as you work your way down into the lower registers. And most of that is done with my little finger, where I actually curl it around and kind of hold onto the E string pretty much any time I'm not playing it. Now, another right-hand technique for dampening is what I call post-dampening, which is after you hit the note, you sometimes want to use the side of your thumb to stop the note from feeding back or whatever. So it's such as if I was to... You can see as I finish the phrase, I actually let the side of my thumb come down. As far as the little finger holding onto the E first, and there'll also be the second finger, which will many times grab the G third, and the third finger, which will grab the B second whenever you're not playing on those. In conjunction with this right hand dampening both bass and treble functions with either the fingers or the side of the palm, there will of course be the left hand dampening. And that, the low notes, I usually try to handle the E6 with my thumb. So if I was to do something like stretching a string on the B second, say, I would be holding on to the E6, kind of just the side of it, just barely touching it. In conjunction with this will be the first finger, which occasionally when I'm playing treble notes, such as... If I want to give them a tremolo effect, I'll reach over and have the first finger kind of just bridge across the other strings to keep them quiet. So the left-hand technique of finger dampening is used also with a tremolo effect if you were going to stretch a note, or if you were just to tremolo back and forth. This especially is where the finger will hold the strings from vibrating. If you're just holding any kind of note, it keeps the others from making noise, especially if you're tremoloing. And as you finish a phrase, then sometimes you'll use your fingers in combination with what I discussed earlier about the post-dampening of the side of the right thumb. And just kind of put your hands across it and kind of keep them from feeding back. It's a process of trial and error of how you can learn through the idiosyncrasies and personal style techniques that you have, how to be everywhere to kind of have the off between the ons of when you're playing the notes. And I kind of think of it as almost a ballet, because if you were to kind of watch the working, it's kind of like a choreography that has to happen. And eventually, if through trial and error, you can kind of, it becomes second nature for a lot of that attempt of it, where you don't have to really think about it so much. But it's a very, very critical part of playing. Maybe not noticed as much as it should be. But what you don't play is a lot of times as important as when you are playing. So I'd like to just a second maybe run through the amps and just do some improvisations, and maybe you be able to just kind of watch just the dampening thing, in particularly more than maybe even the musical passages. Section I'd like to talk about is string stretching. Basically, there's three types that I like to use. Some of these have been covered somewhat on the first video. The first one is called positive string stretching. That is where you practice and you learn to, as you stretch the string, to go right to the next note you want to. So if you were stretching a whole note, or a half note, or if you were doing a minor third. It's a method of where you know the exact note you're going to go to. The best way to kind of do that is if you have a recorder, you can record some chord stuff and then play over it and just make sure you're working on being in tune. That is something that's really important to work on because it gives a more positive approach to stretching the string rather than just aimlessly kind of stretching around, which will not sound quite as tasteful to do. And then besides that technique, there'd be more of the semitone type stretching, which is where you find kind of a place in between, and that's very well used with blues players. It's such as if you listen to B.B. King. It's helpful to listen to blues records to kind of get that kind of inflection down. It's very useful no matter what kind of style you end up playing. And then another way that I like to kind of stretch strings is where I kind of stretch it and then pick the note. It's just kind of a fun thing I like to do. It kind of can mimic kind of a slide guitar type sound. You can also kind of get a steel guitar sound of it. Other variations on string stretching that I like to do is a technique, kind of a koto technique, which is a relatively simple technique to do. It involves both hands, where you fret with the first finger of your right hand, and when you do that, you pick with the thumb of the right hand. And then you also can fret with the third finger of the left hand. But while you are fretting with your right hand, you can use that third finger of the left hand to actually stretch the note behind the note. It also gives it kind of an interesting tone because you're actually picking right next to where you're fretting. So it's a little thinner and kind of koto-ish sounding. And so there's two ways you can do that. You can either stretch the note as you pick it on the right hand, by the left hand, or you can pop off the note from the right and leave the note on the left hand, like. Another technique is the two-note stretch, where you actually do two notes at once. Last little bit again. So another way you could also color the type steel stuff, if you're doing the two-note stuff, is, as we discussed earlier, you can stretch the note up and then pick it. Last bit. You also can add to that volume control. The technique with the volume control really is just using the little finger around it, and you have to kind of play a little early on the beat and then fade it in so that when the fade in will be right on the beat. Of course, you also can use a volume pedal. And if you use this technique with some compression and echo in the studio, it can create quite a non-guitar sound, which is real nice. So the next section I'd like to talk about is vibrato. This is what I feel is a very important technique because it can really, it can portray a very genuine sound to your playing that's very tasteful. And you can really learn it from a lot of the old blues players. I kind of learned the type of tremolo I like from Eric Clapton in the Cream. And also you can hear a lot of wonderful vibrato from Jimi Hendrix on the Electric Ladyland album. Clapton, the way Clapton would do it is he would pivot his wrist. He wouldn't clench the guitar like this. I mean, some ways people, when they vibrato and they hold the guitar tight, what happens is you have a stiff kind of constrained sounding vibrato. Now if I was to take my hand away from the guitar and just let it just be open there and let the power come from the pivot of the wrist. As you can see underneath, there's a pivot point with the wrist, and it's supplying energy to the finger that you're stretching the string and give vibrato. Now, this also can be used to go down. Same technique, but in a more subdued way, can be used just to give vibrato holding a note. It doesn't require as much pivot of the wrist, but you can leave your hand free. While you do this, as we discussed earlier, you'll want to use the dampening technique around those notes. And another thing that I like to kind of do is within a chord context, you might have one note vibratoing and not have the others. For instance, on the last record on the song Pavilion, I tried to bring out a high note to vibrato without doing the other ones, such as... This also can be done with a cleaner tone. It adds a little differentiation to the voicings you're using, kind of like having a melody within the chord. And so one of the final types of tremolo I'd like to talk about, which basically I like to do on acoustic guitar, but every once in a while for a kind of a real soulful sound you want to maybe use on electric, where you just tremolo the effect. It's a classical technique, just going back and forth. Now, the next section of this video, I'd like to talk about 4 major aspects of playing that I kind of try to remember when I'm working on whether it's solos, chords, writing, or whatever. Because there's an old saying, really, it's not what you play, but it's how you play it. So it doesn't matter what style or where you're coming from, but it's like, how do you play what you're playing? And there's some real cardinal universal tips to help put a special, kind of put like a spunk in your playing or whatever. So these are parameters I like to use to sharpen the musical language that is involved for a better message of music. The first one I'm going to call projection, which is projecting your playing. That has to do with note selection. Which notes do you want to use at a particular given place? I mean, I could run through a passage. could just say. See, I played the same thing. It's just the way that you select the notes and the alliteration and which one comes after the other. Or another way I could do it, instead of playing it generically, I could go. So there's a myriad of ways to approach that. Now, once you've selected the note you want to play, it's how do you treat the note? You can use a staccato effect where you just. And there's all different variances in the staccato, how much you use. The staccato thing is basically we're just using more dampening. And sometimes you want to use a legato type thing with a long sustain, so you use less dampening on the right hand and more dampening on the left hand to get more legato. You can mix these up if you want. And then also another part of the projection is the emotion you're trying to get. What's the desired emotion? Is it kind of more pensive, like say if you wanted to... Or is it more off the cuff kind of thing? Kind of thing like that. So you can really dial in the type of emotion you want to do by just playing the same thing basically, but just the way you play it, such as and of course you can play very soulful if you want. Play a little faster. And there's a lot of variances that you can do in there. So it's good to remember all these alphabets of note treatment for projection. Also, another thing I try to remember with projection are dynamics, and that's kind of like the pulse of the music. Now, to me, there are two types of dynamics. There's the larger view of the dynamics, of course, which is in a musical passage where you might want to go from soft to loud. Play around with that, and sometimes actually using a soft dynamic, you'll put more power on the note than a loud dynamic. It can work in inverse ways actually. You can be playing something real soft and then play something real loud out of context, and it will put a certain weight on it. Or you can be playing something very loud and then all of a sudden drop back and play something very, very soft as well. Now, a very important part of dynamics are more of the inner dynamics of the passage of chords or leads you're playing. It's kind of like you're stressing the emphasis where you want the emphasis to be. And I usually think of that like such as the recessive and dominant dynamic qualities of a passage you're making. There's certain notes you want to put more accentuation on. So if I was just going to do, let's just play the notes, but if I wanted to bring out certain notes and put others back, type of recessed dominant. One note will be loud, one other note will be soft, will be more recessive to create a swing into the next note. And this is a very important thing to me. That's what gives the kind of breathes life into the particular passage or chords you're playing. These treatments are available at any time to mix and mash and whatever. That's part of the beauty of it. You can just mix them all up and create your own personal thing. Okay, the next thing I'd like to talk about of these aspects is it's kind of having a flair to what you do. I would describe that as kind of the flow people talk about, where you let chances happen or you take chances. You play off the cuff and see what just kind of comes up, and that's one of the things that I like about string skipping, where it's just you have So I'd like to just point out a certain aspect about string skipping. Basically, the way I look at it is you're replacing certain notes into another octave. Say if I was just going to play like, I could play instead. So that would be once again. And one of the advantages that I like about string skipping is if you're in fact coming across a note that could be interchanged with an open string, then it gets even a little more interesting. So if I was going to go like, I could play something kind of the same. I could. Let me just repeat that sort of one more time. Could be replaced with. And one of the ways of string skipping is just to do wider intervals. If I was So if I was to try to simplify the idea of a string skipping, basically you could take it as if you were just and then with that passage where it's a lot of just different inversions of either a minor or a major chord, then you just substitute certain notes, and you could just put them somewhere else. that's just one of the ways that I like to try to put a little flair in it. You're kind of expanding the way you might typically approach guitar. And these things can always change. One kind of philosophy I try to remember is just always to be a student of the guitar, because that way you always stay open to what you can learn. And also a word about practicing. I tend to be a fan of when you're practicing to try to keep an element of fun in it, to where you're really enjoying practicing and it doesn't become too dull, because that can keep you from wanting to keep practicing. So part of my practice regimen, actually most of my practice regimen, is just to work on songs, and once I find a part I like, then I'll keep working on that and try to better and better that. Okay, and the third aspect I'd like to talk about I call strength and focus. And I believe one way to accomplish this is to not try too hard mentally when you're trying to play a certain musical passage. Just the same as if we tense our muscles when we play, we won't appropriately be able to execute a passage as well as when we're relaxed. In the same way, if we try too hard mentally, it can affect our performance as well. So sometimes we might not even necessarily think we're playing that well, but we might in fact actually be upon if we were to go back and listen to it again. Sometimes it's, to know when to play with restraint, and maybe to fall back on playing a melody instead of a lead solo. You play more melodically, and that'll create more pulse and more dynamics for when you really bear in and play more patterns rather than melodies. So the two kind of go hand in hand and create a kind of an intense dynamic that will keep that pulse going with the music. It's something I try to remember. And a lot of times that means simplifying, so you have those off between the ons. And additionally, patterns and techniques, you should always remember, no matter how much you work on them, it's kind of like getting more books for your library, but that doesn't mean you need to use every book at any given moment. They're merely tools to help to get to a greater creative effort, which is the musical statement and ideas that you're saying. And the destination of that musical idea really should encompass the three important aspects of music, which are melody, harmony, and rhythm. And I try to work on that when I'm composing. So the fourth and final aspect I would like to talk about is signature. And by that I mean trying to create your own original voice. And a lot of that will be from the different players that you like. You can kind of amalgamate your own style from all the players that you like, what really keeps you connected and interested in guitar. You can create a certain package of those players, and you can put in your own special articulation. For example, I like to kind of fool around with the coda thing, or the string skipping, or the stretching, notes, or whatever, little techniques that, if you can kind of keep yourself open to finding your own little aspect of articulation, you can add a certain signature to your sound. Now, another way to create a wider aperture of your signature of your sound is to listen to other instruments other than guitar. For instance, I like to listen to violin and piano, and the licks that will be played on those instruments, as well as the way they're attacked, and the tonality of them will be somewhat different than even most guitar things that you'll hear. So it will give you a real fresh slant on something that you can infuse into your music, and it keeps a way of extracting your own personal signature by listening to other instruments.